Uncle Ralph, can I get you to sit down as the guest of honor? Now that Rolly and Bob and his wife are here.
Where are Rolly and his wife?
They're right here in front of you.
And look who's here.
Hey, look who's here.
Who let you out?
Can you have a seat, Uncle Ralph? And then Nancy and Mary will arrive shortly, so maybe we ought to get started.
Right here. Yes. Yes. There's another celebration. It's wonderful.
Sorry.
I'm glad you're happy.
And we've invited Bill Yankee to speak for a few minutes about whatever he wants to talk about.
Thank you for the honor of being allowed to speak to you tonight. I mean, it's a thrill to have such an important family here at the Octagon House. The Gaeblers have such a long history in connection with not only the Historical Society, but with Watertown's history as well itself. In reading through that extraordinarily wonderful document, the Gaebler Museum, I was amazed to realize that they were descendants of the Blumenfeld family, who were David Blumenfeld, the editor of the Watertown Weltbürger, our German language newspaper here, and of course Ralph Blumenfeld, who was the editor of the London Daily Express. And not only that, but the Wiggenhorn family, who were our pioneer cigar makers and hotel keepers. So this was an incredibly wonderful thing to be honored by allowing me to speak before you. I know that you're on a schedule, so I will keep my speech brief. What I wanted to do was basically relate a little bit of the formation of the Historical Society and Hans Gaebler's contribution. And when I say contribution, I really shouldn't leave it at that, because in reality, Hans Gaebler was very likely the founder of our Watertown Historical Society. I need not tell you about Hans Gaebler, because those of you that grew up with him, of course, knew all about him, and anyone else can read his reminiscences. He was a fascinating gentleman, and I would love to have met him, because I have no doubt he could have schooled me and everyone else in chapter and verse on anything that happened here in the city. He was a school teacher, a law librarian, an astronomer. He was a traveler. He was a soldier. He was a pioneer aviator. It was just amazing to read of his exploits. And not only that, but his exploits of his ancestors, such as Emil Gaebler, who was our pioneer melodeon and organ maker here in Watertown on North 4th Street. And he also, of course, was the founder of the Concordia Opera Society. We have one of Mr. Gaebler's original organ cases, some pieces of it, left here, and it holds a revered spot in our collections. And of course, Max Gaebler was one of the founders of the Watertown Cable Slide Company. So this was quite an impressive family. But what I said was I wanted to zero in on the Historical Society. And I based most of my research on our early minutes, which were kept from 1933 onward, which was in itself a revelation to read, because we really started from nothing and rose over the years to what we are now, with 3 museum buildings and a fine tour center here as well. How Mr. Gaebler became interested in forming a historical society, I'm not certain, but he was an excellent historian, and he had a strong bent for history, given the fact that he had the strong heritage in Watertown. And no doubt, since he lived in a beautiful Tudor home just up the street, that he knew the Thomases who lived here in the Octagon House. Billy Thomas and his mother, Anna Richards Thomas. She was the eldest daughter of John and Eliza Richards, who built this beautiful home in 1854. At the time when they probably became acquainted, it was in the 1920s, and at that point the Thomases were living in basically 3 rooms in this house, very likely. 2 bedrooms upstairs and the kitchen, because it was the warmest room in the house in the wintertime. You can imagine, with 57 rooms in this house, it was very difficult to maintain it, especially when these were more or less elderly people who did not have a steady income. And so he realized the rare architectural gem that this was, and the fact that this was a place well worth preserving. So he called a group of people who were of like mind to come together to begin talking about forming an historical society. Among the people he brought in were John Clifford, who was the editor and publisher of the Watertown Daily Times, and Claire Harriman, who served as a librarian and had a strong family ties to the city. Miss Ella Wilder, who was actually his grade school teacher, who also had strong historical background here. And last but not least, he brought in Gladys Mullard, who was at that point working with the Red Cross and a social worker, but she was also a half-sister of the Braineman family, the Flower Kings, and her father was the inventor of the automatic golf ball washer. So they were all people of strong ties and very interesting backgrounds. They met here, they met in the house up on Thomas Avenue, and they began to lay out plans for a historical society. They drew up bylaws, they drew up a list of goals and purposes, and in March of 1933, they finally, March or April, I can never remember the date off the top of my head, they had a public meeting at the old high school on 8th Street, which was my alma mater here in Watertown. In fact, just about everybody who lived in Watertown up until, well, about 1994 was their alma mater. Then it was torn down. It's a lovely parking lot now, as are so many buildings on Main Street and off streets. But in any event, I digress. They had a public meeting and drew up a lot of interest, and people began to join. Sadly, at the next meeting, according to the minutes, he had to resign. And I'm sure it was done with a great deal of difficulty and soul searching, but this was at the height of the Depression. And he, I'm sure, had business matters because he had come back here from Chicago to take over the reins of the Table Slide Company from his father, who had just passed away. And I'm sure it was difficult trying to maintain a family and having to run a business, let alone a side interest of a historical society that was just getting off the ground. But he never left the historical society entirely. He maintained a constant interest in the things that were going on. He served as a director at large. He was the liaison between us and the State Historical Society and wrote about our yearly activities for their newsletter, the Wisconsin Magazine of History. And then in 1936, he officially rejoined the board and was elected president of the Watertown Historical Society. 1936 is a sort of milestone for Watertown because at that time Watertown was celebrating its 100th anniversary of its founding. He was on the committee established by the mayor to properly recognize that fact and create displays and set up the parade and things of that nature. Hans Gaebler's main goal that he began pushing for once he became president was to get the Richards family relations who owned this house, this property, to deed it over to the Watertown Historical Society. They were reluctant at this time because we were a struggling organization. And I think if you talk to our current president, Melissa, she'll tell you we are still a struggling organization. But he persevered. He continued to, with the board's help, inundate the Richards family with entreaties to please don't turn it over to the city for civic purposes or for a rec center. Turn it over to us. We want to run it as a museum. We want to restore this property and honor the memories of John and Eliza Richards. It took until 1937 and the death of Billy Thomas, who was the last relative to live here in the house itself, before the family finally made up its mind to deed the property over to us. And in 1938, we officially took ownership of this property. And with that act, Hans Gaebler felt that he could finally resign and step down from the office of presidency. The board minutes reflect that his resignation was accepted with deepest regret. And I can only imagine just how deep that regret was felt by losing their their leader, who really got them a museum and who established us, made us a force to be reckoned with. But again, even though he was not officially a board member or an officer, he did not lose his interest in the Historical Society and kept attending the meetings, kept attending the meetings at the State Historical Society on our behalf. In 1940, he championed a cause which was sort of misguided, unfortunately. He felt it was important that we, and I only go by the minutes, of course, he felt it was important that we mark the geographic center of Watertown. There's a meridian stone located over on the South 2nd and Wisconsin Streets by St. Paul's Episcopal Church. And it is in the ground. It's dated 1844, and that was a surveying stone. And supposedly that is the geographic center of the city, and he felt it imperative that the Historical Society put a special marker. Unfortunately, the Historical Society at that point did not have the money, or, and I hate to say it, but they did not have the interest in marking that. But in 1941, he did do something that would have far-reaching consequences on the Historical Society, and indeed, Watertown and Wisconsin history in general. At a regular public meeting, he brought 3 distinguished gentlemen from Milwaukee, 3 historians, and they asked a pointed question of the board of directors here. They wanted to know why we, the city of Watertown, was not trying to save the first kindergarten building, because there was talk of it being torn down at that point. Unfortunately, nothing happened until 1956, but it got the ball rolling. It brought it to the attention of everyone, and really we can thank Hans Gaebler for getting us the first kindergarten building for its preservation. In about once the World War II broke out, he and his wife and family left the city and went to Milwaukee. According to his obituary, he served the government as a translator of German documents for the war effort, and then later retired and passed away there in 1951. He's buried, of course, at Oak Hill Cemetery. And I want to leave you with a passage that was written about him, and I will quote it verbatim, in his obituary, because it sort of sums up this active life. The Daily Times wrote, "In any list of men and women who have contributed much to the betterment and progress of Watertown as a community of homes and family life, the name of Hans T. Gaebler must definitely be included. He did much that was worthwhile, and those who knew him best will always remember him for it." As I say, I would like to have known him. He had to have been one of the most fascinating gentlemen to sit down and talk with. And I can think of no better way to end this little review than by quoting that. "We who serve on the board of directors today, we who have served or are serving as officers or presidents of this august body, all owe him a great debt of gratitude, and we rise in unison to salute him and to salute the Gaebler family, and in particular, Mr. Ralph Gaebler." And so I thank you very much tonight for letting me to speak before you.
Of us, only David knew. He remembers that vague memory of meeting my grandfather once, I think. But he, in fact, died the evening before my older sister was born. Mary will be arriving here shortly, I hope. So none of us really had the chance to know him, unfortunately. But thank you for your thoughtful and generous remarks. And thank you, Auntie Gladys, for doing so much for so long to secure the foundation and advance the vision of the Watertown Historical Society. And thank you, Melissa, and the other board members who work with such dedication to ensure the future of the Watertown Historical Society. My grandfather would be pleased to see what has grown from the germ planted, so to speak, in that living room on Thomas Avenue now so many years ago, to know that the cause is in able hands being carefully tended. And most importantly, thank you, Uncle Ralph, for being here this evening. When I called recently about lunch and you answered, I think in jest, by saying, I thought I asked you to stop calling this number, I began to wonder whether you would be a willing participant here this evening. Bachelor uncles are a wonderful institution. Everybody should have one. What is a male analog of the fairy godmother? I don't know, but that's what Uncle Ralph was for all of us when we were young children. Generous gifts and enchanted outings. Uncle Ralph always had a fleet of astonishing cars and even more extraordinary friends. Ed Reedy, Tom Larkin, Jerry Pendergast, Val Kaiser, Freddie Brigantini, the Great Healer, Jimmy Arani. And then there were the various character actors playing more minor roles around the edges. Stan Landis, Cracker Keatman, Cecil Sprewell, Annie, and Butchie the dog, who Uncle Ralph always hated unbeknownst to Annie. With Uncle Ralph in Chicago, it was visit the Museum of Science and Industry. In Milwaukee, it was move cars around between various garages in clandestine, quasi-legal parking places and go to Webb's or similar venues to eat with Uncle Ralph and his buddies. Uncle Ralph likely shuddered, or at least shivered, each time my father called to suggest another visit by a nephew or niece, but Uncle Ralph was always a gracious host. When we were little, David got to spend more time with Uncle Ralph than I did. But over the last 30 years, I've made it a mission to correct this injustice. As I'm always quick to note, Milwaukee is a fabulous place to live. I haven't done any empirical research, but it's hard for me to believe that there could be any place more comfortable to live than Milwaukee, provided one is of European descent, of course. And of all things that have made Milwaukee wonderful, Uncle Ralph is first and foremost. When Andrea and I first moved to Milwaukee, Uncle Ralph and I watched the want ads and often went out in the evening to look for an older car, or at an older car, and for an older car. Sunday mornings we had breakfast at Webb's. Since the arrival of our kids, Uncle Ralph has been part of all our birthday celebrations, holidays, and big events in Shorewood. And more recently, how many lunches have we had at Kegel's? I remember once, with Uncle Ralph and Carrie, then about 2 or 3, bringing Jimmy Arani right here to the Octagon House. Then we stopped for lunch at Virginia's, the large Jimmy Arani squeezing into the smallish house. Virginia confusingly putting dishes on and pulling dishes off the table, a blizzard of stops and starts, until Jimmy, in his rather imperial manner, beckoned her to sit and be still, which for once she actually did. Rolly has sometimes said, or told me, that Uncle Ralph is fortunate that we live in Milwaukee. I'm not sure that Uncle Ralph really feels exactly that way. But I am sure that my siblings and I were fortunate as children to have Uncle Ralph in our lives. And I know we Shorewoodians have been fortunate that Uncle Ralph has been part of our family in Milwaukee. Uncle Ralph likes to tell stories about his great uncle, Uncle Arthur. Arthur Gaebler, born in 1872, a witty provocateur and inveterate needler of his older sister, Aunt Sophie. According to Uncle Ralph, my grandfather characterized his uncle, that is Uncle Arthur, as a case of arrested adolescence. Perhaps that's so, but Uncle Ralph still relished his great-uncle's visits to Milwaukee, to Watertown. I fancy that 50 or 60 years from now, Carrie, Carl, and Hans will be telling young Gaebler somewhere about their great-uncle, a man who surveyed the world from his own, sometimes peculiarly personal perch, and who was so often ready with a pithy, amusing observation. Anyway, as you all know, our uncle was born in 1926. So he approaches a certain milestone, which although it is to remain unmentioned, we don't want to let pass unacknowledged. Hence our gathering here this evening. Now would be an opportune time to drink Uncle Ralph's good health and prosperity. To that end, I invite all to step to the bar, grab a glass, and I cede the floor to my brother David.
She was very proud.
I've always counted on it. Clearly, there's some genetic material here from Aunt Sophie. And I always thought, well, you know, people talk about Aunt Sophie did all right. She was pretty healthy. Yeah, I know. She set herself up for that. But I love the idea that I just want to spell flowers.
I think everybody's heard that. Mary?
Yes. Yes.
I can't really clink these plastic glasses without probably disastrous results. But John did make the mistake of ceding the floor to me, so I'll be happy to take it over, as it were. And John, as many of you may know, is someone who, when he gets a project going, gets a bit in his mouth. He really keeps going. So as he said, that he's been working the last 30 or 40 years to make up for the extra time that I did get to spend with great Uncle Ralph as a child. I'm sure he has been doing a good job of that and really working at it, and apparently to the point of Uncle Ralph having to tell him not to call this number anymore. But fortunately, he did answer once more and got over here this afternoon. So, of course, I want to offer my congratulations on this unmentioned but upcoming milestone event down the road, and remind you that you do still have almost 3 entire months to enjoy being only 89. So,
I will make the best of it. Something, you know, 80 didn't bother me. But 90, there's nothing nice about 90.
What do you think, Rolly?
it's not divisible by 4, maybe that's the problem.
Well, however, I would rather be there than nowhere.
Well, anyway, here is to our Uncle Ralph, and as we now know him, great Uncle Ralph, although we've really known him as great Uncle Ralph for a long, long time, because as John said, he has been great Uncle Ralph.
He's still Uncle Ralph to me.
I'm simply saying he has not just been an Uncle Ralph, but a great Uncle Ralph all along.
And I would say he's been an Uncle Ralph to many people, not just in the family.
So, here's Uncle Ralph.
God love you.
Well, I guess I can drink to myself.
Yeah. What did you do?
She was just out of the cemetery. So I hope you know. I always had to laugh.
David has remembered when we come over to visit Uncle Ralph when we were little. We'll be driving around Milwaukee with him, and suddenly pull up with the fur. It's all right, get out, get in this car. Like no explanation or, any, forewarning.
Yeah, long those cars. And do you continue with that?
I did for a
Oh, good.
What are you going to do? You don't know yet.
But I'm not sure where they went.
It's right behind you. It's going that way.
You can. Are you going on the tour?
I am. A long time since
I've never been on it yet. I've never been on it.